Now we're on to planning. How are Jen and Jay actually going to pull this off? First, they list all their assumptions. First one, families have a substantial desire to organize quality time, or slow time as they're calling it. This needs to be proven. Easy ways that they can initially prove out the assumption are to run online ads using Google AdWords, Facebook ads with various versions of this proposition. Users click through, and then secondly, Jen and Jay are going to see whether on the landing pages that these users arrive at, do they click around and look for more information? Do they sign up on a sign up list to find more about this? That tells them a lot about the level of general pre-existing interest in the proposition. Secondly, families are on Facebook. This is not a proposition that needs to be proven. It's important, but it can be generally accepted. There's data out there. People will accept this. Same thing with the proposition that family members regularly use mobile apps. Families will find the pheasant solution credible. This definitely needs to be proven. Jen and Jay can test these signups that we mentioned previously against a more detailed version of the proposition and see which ones resonate. They can put together some informational content to send out to these users and see how that takes, and they can do their beta tests. But it turns out the more Jen and Jay grapple with this issue of whether they're really experts on this idea of creating quality time for families, the more they wonder whether they don't need to look at a different way of maybe doing this. From her time in Sacramento and San Diego, Jen remembers hearing about a book on this idea of creating quality time or slow time. It's by a guy named Jack Fuzzy Chernow. This isn't a real guy, I made it up. So Jen and Jay, while they're grappling with this issue, whether they're really experts on this idea of creating quality time, get in touch with Jack Chernow, and lo and behold, he loves the idea of translating his ideas into an app, a website, a service, and they make a deal together. And this is a synthetic example. I made this all up, but this idea of including editorial content into your product is increasingly relevant, especially in the consumer space. Users are increasingly paying for content, not pure technology. So Jen and Jay revisit their assumptions. They keep going here. The next assumption they have is that these pivot users, these pivot parents, they'll find traction, they'll find purchase with these people, and they'll do that by looking at the take rate with these pivot users that they'll have direct contact with. How much do they actually use the app? During follow-ups, do they say it's working for them? They like it? And then will these pivot users go out and recommend the thing? And this, they can introduce promotion codes and see if they see those showing up with these pivot parents' friends. And this really encapsulates the first hypothetical iteration of Jen and Jay's business. They validate these assumptions. That's a pretty good pivot or persevere moment at that point for them to figure out whether they should scale up and press ahead with this thing, or whether they need to revise their concept. On this topic of organic user acquisition or viral user acquisition, there's, I think, a widespread misperception that if something's good, it will go viral. And while there's maybe examples of that and a certain amount of truth to that, there are plenty of successes out there that are probably thought to be viral by and large, but were actually very closely choreographed. And this idea that good is viral is definitely not a good way to think about your user acquisition. You want to use this set of assumptions, this hypothesis, this scientific method to lay out what you think is going to happen and look at whether it's really happening or not. The most classical model in high tech for this is the technology adoption life cycle, which was supplemented by Jeff Moore in his book Crossing the Chasm, with this idea that between innovators and early adopters, there's a big chasm between these folks and your first beachhead in the early majority of the mainstream market that will really, really hockey stick your growth. And that's because there are people out there who love to try things out, but they're just fundamentally different than the people who are looking at this stuff from a utilitarian, relatively conservative standpoint. This was a little bit of a bigger deal back when, 10 years ago, when technology purchases were more about big, high stakes platform decisions that involved spending a lot of money and high switching costs. The switching costs for an app or an online app are very low. They're not zero. You have to invest your time and see if you like it and set it up and maybe do something social with your friends, but relatively speaking, it's much lower. Another maybe more flexible idea of thinking about this is pool, billiards. I'm not a great pool player, but the first thing I learned about pool beyond hitting the ball was that you've got to look at where the cue ball, the white ball, is going to end up after you take your shot. Is that going to leave you with another shot? Because it's about progressing through the table, not just making one shot at a time. And that's a good way to think about user acquisition. The most important point is to use this idea of the scientific method of laying out your assumptions and then running experiments to see if what you expect to have happen is actually happening. Don't just look at nice monthly percentage growth numbers because you may be headed for a glass wall, or worse yet, you may be ignoring great things that are happening with user acquisition that you're under investing in. Here we have the business model canvas. So we're going to go through this in the case of Pheasant, Jen and Jay's company. Customer segments. They're looking at families with kids. Value propositions. Their main value proposition is a quality of life improvement. Convenience and usability to that end is a key thing for them as well. But let's remember, convenience and usability in and of itself is something they ruled out as a leading value proposition. So they're really looking at this idea of creating quality time, of creating a quality of life improvement. Channels, they're going to use Jack Chernow, the author's website. They'll also be distributing apps through Facebook, iTunes, and the Android store, and they'll try running ads through those and seeing how that works out. Customer relationships. Well, these pivot parents, these mavens, they're going to get dedicated personal assistants. That's partly because that's how they're going to learn about what's going on, particularly since most of the most important things that are happening with this app actually happen offline, and also because if they're not successful with those folks, they don't have anything to really learn after that. The mainstream market for this is going to be a self-service experience. People sign up online, they pay online without any direct intervention. Revenue streams. Advertising and sponsorship are their primary revenue streams. They have a very well encapsulated demographic, which will help them a lot. They need to be careful about not being invasive with the ads, but they should do pretty well there. They're going to have a premium subscription model as well, where maybe you pay to get access on mobile apps, maybe you pay to get more content. They'll work that out as they go along. Key resources. Well, Jack is a key resource, the author. He is going to supply editorial content to them, and they recognize that they've hitched their wagons together. Good user experience, UX, and the development are also, of course, key resources. Key activities. Well, first and foremost, they're problem solvers. They have to be utterly obsessed with this idea of creating quality time for families. That's their job. And then they may move on to other key activities as they expand the franchise. And that will dovetail maybe with key partners. So right now they have Jack on this idea of creating quality time. Maybe they'll do shopping lists curated by celebrity chefs or nutritionists. And cost structure, they have a big fixed cost basis for their development. That's very common for a technology company. And then they pay royalties to Jack for his content. On the planning side, they've given themselves 8 months, and that's because they think their first pivot will occupy 4 months, and another 4 months gives them a chance to do at least one more pivot, they think. You'll notice they're loaning the company $290,000. Half of that is going to go to pay Jen and Jay's salary, and they're loaning it into the company entity themselves. Half of it's coming from a loan that Jay's family is going to make, and that's to pay contractors and defray expenses. You can see that over time, over the first 3 months, the contract expenses ramp. That's because Jen and Jay want to make sure they're real clear about what they want to build before they bring on additional contractor resources and start spending money on that. Lastly, you can see they've assumed zero revenue. They hope to have revenue towards the end of this period, but they don't want to have a revenue shortfall and then be scrambling around and trying to make ends meet. They want to give themselves an 8-month pivot where they don't have to worry about money. There is a template online on alexandercowan.com/fin plan. It'll be online by August 15th. That is a pre-made template for doing this sort of thing. So let's step through this idea of the scientific method applied to Jen and Jay's company. They had an idea. This idea of slow time emerged from their research, their design thinking, their resulting empathy, and a little bit of creative destruction, right? They threw out their old idea of organizational tools in favor of this idea of focusing on quality time. They created a hypothesis around that there's an interest among parents in creating this slow time, that they can make a credible app, and that pivotal users will spread the word for them. They've created a set of experiments, posting promotions online, working with these pivotal parents on their beta and subsequent targeted releases to see if they're barking up the right tree. This will give them data where they can figure out, are they really right? Do they have a business here, or do they need to revise their idea? At that point, they'll either revise, pivot, as they say in the lean startup, or persevere and scale up the business, raise some more money, go at it, hire more people, start promoting heavier.